Before we dive in, here's another show you can enjoy in the True Story FM family of entertainment podcasts. Hey there, true believers. Andy Nelson here from the Marvel Movie Minute podcast with the rest of the team.
Pete Wright, Kyle Olson,
Rob Cabasco,
and Matthew Fox.
This is the podcast where we dissect the Marvel Cinematic Universe 1 minute at a time, exploring every detail of this epic superhero franchise.
From the nods to the comics to the electrifying performances, we've had a blast diving into every aspect of the MCU. Right from the start, we're talking about them having to earn their wizards. And I think we've made a good argument that they do.
We have our favorite recurring bits, like 5 stars for Spar, because every character deserves their moment in the spotlight.
Ooh, Kyle, speaking of spotlights, did you know that the term advertisement actually comes from the Latin advertere, meaning to turn toward? That's exactly the kind of fascinating detail we love to uncover on the show.
But it's not all trivia and recurring bits. We also dive deep into the ethical dilemmas our heroes face. Loki alone provides enough material for a whole season on superhero morality. Not to mention that I can't wait till we get to Civil War.
In our season looking at Iron Man 3, we're going to mix things up a bit.
That's right, Rob and I are your guides, but instead of our usual minute-by-minute format, we dive into 5 minutes of the film in each weekly episode.
It's a totally new approach, but one that still allows us to explore all the depth and detail that makes these movies so special, even if Iron Man 3 isn't all that special.
Hold on, that's where you're wrong. Extremist, Shane Black.
Yeah, would you like to look at the Mandarin and Maya Hansen? Mm-hmm.
So whether you're a die-hard Marvel fan or just love deep dives into movies, there's something for everyone on Marvel Movie Minute.
Suit up and join us on this epic audio adventure. You can find us at truestory.fm or by searching Marvel Movie Minute on your favorite podcatcher.
Because in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, every minute is packed with excitement.
Enough said.
I hope you like mustard. Bye.
Ever wonder where the devil got his horns?
How about those cloven hooves?
Or that pitchfork?
Wasn't he an angel?
No, he was a snake.
No, he's the great red dragon.
No, he's the beast.
He's the prince of this world.
Prince of darkness.
Well, he's the prince of dark.
Good morning, star lovelies. One of my names is Lester Ryan Clark.
And I sometimes go by Keenan Diaz.
And we're the hosts of the brand new podcast, The Devil's Details. What comes to mind when I say Lucifer?
How about Satan?
What about just the devil? How did the big bad of the Western world end up with so many faces? Join us as we dig up, decipher, and deconstruct the devil's many forms throughout history.
Take a guided tour with Dante through the 9 circles of hell.
Or revisit Satan's angsty bad boy years in Paradise Lost.
Learn the ins and outs of a Faustian contract.
Easier than a 1099, but with a hell of a lot more fine print.
Slither on over to The Devil's Details on True Story FM and join us in the diabolic discussion.
Love and hisses. Mwah! Didn't Al Pacino play him in a movie?
Are you sure that wasn't Robert De
I
Niro?
could have sworn it was Tim Curry.
That was Elizabeth
Didn't
Hurley.
he go down to Georgia at some point?
Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Friends, today we're bringing you an episode that was actually intended to go out a few weeks earlier around the time of Thanksgiving here in the United States. We had a couple of technical delays on my part, so it's a little bit past topic, but we still think it's something that's relevant and we want to talk about. And that's the topic of Indigenous Native representation in the stories we love. Riki has been trying for a little while to get me to watch the movie Prey, a movie that I was a lot more interested in kind of the fact that it existed than the movie itself, and I'll talk more about that as we get into it. Our discussion of that movie, which for those who don't know, it is a Predator style movie. It's very much it is a part of the Predator franchise with very much a Predator character, but it's set in what would become the United States. That at that point the native territories that the French were starting to encroach on in the 1760s. And most of the cast and crew and most of the cast and people who worked on the movie are themselves native. And so we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about some other instances of Native American representation in movies, both good and bad, including Dances with Wolves, which is a pretty seminal work in terms of like a marker of, how was representation like at the time that movie was made in the 80s. And we'll talk about that and the good and the bad and some of the other things that came around it. But Riki, let me just start by giving you a chance to say hello and then asking you kind of why was Prey a movie you were so excited for me to watch and talk about?
Well, hello, Matthew and listeners. Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I love horror as a
Hmm.
genre, and the Predator franchise is a science fiction horror at
Right.
its core. And I've been watching these movies for a while, and they mostly aren't good.
Yeah, that's fair.
Especially when you get into the crossover aliens versus Predator.
Right.
Prey is arguably the best movie in the franchise.
Mm.
Now, you'd have to put it up against the original Predator, and
Hmm.
it shares like a mood to it,
Yeah.
right? Whereas a lot of the other ones just become gun fests and stuff.
Hmm.
There's a real like 1v1 like warrior battle element to Prey and the original Predator. Once you get down to just Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Right.
And so like I watched it as a Predator franchise movie. I was like, "Oh, like this is like taking the franchise back in a good
Hmm.
way in my opinion." And then on top of that, the way that they presented the protagonist
Hmm.
and the way that it just feels genuine, I think is what really struck me.
Yeah. I definitely hear that. I want to talk about those elements. I'll just start by saying a little bit about the movie myself. I I think I was able to watch this and go, this is one of the best examples, I think, of this genre. Not just Predator itself, but the whole like, a single monster against a single, protagonist chasing each other through an environment. And I'm so happy it got made. And I'm so happy for the incredible representation and sort of what that means for Hollywood. And I still don't like Predator movies because I like got to the end of it and I was like, that's it was like if someone made like the absolute best cream of mushroom soup that you could imagine. I would admire the cookery. I would admire how good everything is, and I still wouldn't like cream of mushroom soup. Um, but I think I was able to really appreciate like, oh, okay, they're doing these things with the genre that I think you're right, both really honor the genre and don't change it, but also say like, look, if this is about an alien, oh, aliens would have come to indigenous peoples as well. Certainly in our own mythos of like, there's lots of native communities that have myths of beings from other worlds that come. It's not just like white people or whatever it is that have those kind of ideas. So yeah, I'm and we're not here to talk about the quality of the movie. I think I can easily acknowledge that like I think the acting, the cinematography, the way the drama was done is far better than any of the movies, probably including the Arnold one, although that does have a special place in my heart, both because of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Carl Weathers. And as someone who was a lover of the Rocky movies, that was kind of the merger of my two favorite, steroid laden men with incredible muscles movie franchises. Um,
And the classic arm clasp that
yep.
has been memeified, and I think a lot of people don't even recognize or remember that that's where it's for a while. Like I didn't. I was like, wait a minute, what is this from? Like this is familiar. And there's a scene where Arnold and Carl Weathers clasp their arms in greeting, and
Yeah.
then that has become the iconic image.
Yeah. That's funny. I didn't even realize that it is from this, but you're right. And I'll say one other thing that I think is a little bit ironic, because actually on a different podcast that talked about the original Predator a couple of months ago, I think here on it was the Next Real Film podcast. That original movie does something that is kind of like it is very cynical, but kind of brilliant of Hollywood, in that they do want to have a big gun fest, and they do want to have our American heroes going and killing the commies. But also, this was the late 80s when we're supposed to maybe not be so quite gung ho about it. So, forgive me, spoilers for a movie that's 40 years old, 30 years old. Um, there's an early scene in which the heroes go and because they're supposed to be an American, basically like GI, commando unit, and utterly wipe out this community of locals. And I don't think they ever quite tell you what Latin American, probably Central American nation it is. But this is at a time when US troops were fighting in Honduras, in Guatemala, in Nicaragua, in Panama. Like, so it is one of those places, probably. And it may well be that they identify it. I don't remember. And so you get the scene of kind of horrific slaughter that probably as an 8-year-old, I was like, yeah, that's great. And then later we realized that the Carl Weathers' character is a CIA operative who actually had fooled Arnold Schwarzenegger into thinking that these were communists, and actually it was just like a native community in this Latin American country that wasn't fully on board with what the right-wing government was doing, or some it was some kind of like political machinations. So you both got to have the look, let's cheer as the Americans go and shoot them all up, but then have the moral purity of, oh, but no, actually this was American CIA doing bad things, so it's okay. So I just want to kind of ethically highlight that, both because of the hypocrisy there and the cynicism, but also because it was almost, I don't think it's ever named, but that was almost definitely a native, like an indigenous community within a Latin American country that gets slaughtered. So pulling us back to the movie Prey itself, let's talk about the representation in it. Tell us more about kind of like who is the protagonist, and what went into making this movie.
Yeah, so the main protagonist, the character's name is Naru, and she is played by Amber Midthunder, who is already maybe or is on the verge of stardom.
Right.
She was also in the Avatar live action as the Princess of the North, and I think she's in a bunch of upcoming projects, and just seems like on the verge again, like if not already a star. And absolutely, like this movie Prey was released in 2022, and I think has really put her on the map. The other primary actor is Dakota Beavers, who plays Tabi, her brother, and there are a bunch of other, and they are both Native American people. Let me see. I have the specifics. So
Comanche, I believe they're both part of the Comanche Nation.
The characters, the characters are Comanche. Amber Midthunder is listed as a bunch of things, primarily Navajo, because this heritage is like not just a set tribe, right? Like there's, at this point, because of what has happened historically, there's been a lot of crossover. Dakota Beavers is Oke Owinge Pueblo. I hope I have pronounced that accurately. And then the other important person, I think, in all of this is one of the producers of the movie, Jane Myers, is Comanche and Blackfoot. And I feel like her role in this is as important as the performers, if not more so, just from a like authenticity standpoint, right? Like she was there to make sure that everything looked right, sounded right, that it was authentic to like the Comanche experience.
Right.
And put, if she wasn't aware herself, like putting the people in charge, like in touch with people. And I believe this was filmed in central Canada on native land there, and they went through the proper steps and honored the people in the land, and did a commencement upon starting of the filming. So like all of that, right? Like you showing respect to the people that you're portraying, I think is as important to the process as like using native representation in the cast.
I think that is so important, especially because not only is this about, like, it's one thing to do that in a modern day story, but this is specifically about a story about Native people, the Comanche people in this story, and it's set in 1719. Where, so not only are you studying a people that is so rarely studied, but also the history of it. It's not just like this person can say, "Oh, my lived experience as a Comanche person today is this." It's that we're talking to people who have really studied the history, and I think it's particularly important because one of the plot there are white folks who are coming into the land, but it's set in 1719. This is just when initial contact between in this case, it's French fur trappers and the native folks, has maybe started in the last like 30 to 50 years. And I say that because, I mean, we don't have many white people's histories of like histories written by white people of what these folks were like. and the ones we have are probably incredibly untrustworthy. So we're going to this is about the study of, you know, what are the native historians, what are the people who've been studying this community, not this community through the eyes of the white people, because like there is that contact with the French trappers that becomes a major plot point, but for the most part, this is about a community that is fairly untouched by the white folks who have come to their continent.
Yeah, and that's, I think, for me as someone who obviously is not native, like I don't know for certain like how
Yep.
authentic this is, right? Like I have to, as an audience member, you have to take some of it on trust, and the fact that certain people are involved in this, I think, gives me that trust.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I think that's really important because a lot of the other like primary people, I believe, are white. Um, but again, like the positioning of Jane Myers, who's like involved in a lot of like native centric movies and TV shows, like that to me is like, okay, like you are putting someone here specifically like to do a thing that is very important
Right.
for this project. Um, and I don't know, it's very difficult, right? Like we as audience members, I don't, it's always hard to say like what is good and what is bad representation. You have to listen to the people. And for the most part, like the people, like the native reviewers and critics have said like, yeah, this is good. And one of the things that we didn't mention yet is that there is a dubbed version of this
Mm-hmm.
movie available that is dubbed in Comanche.
Right.
And what I have read is that this is the first time ever in movie history that has been done.
That's what I've read as well, and that originally Hulu didn't think that, because this was produced by Hulu, I believe, and they did not think that that would be necessary, but that was requested by a lot of people, and so they wound up putting that out. And even in the English language version, which the one I saw, and I'm presuming you saw, um, there is a lot of Comanche spoken. They
Mhm.
switch it, instead of making a movie that's mostly subtitled, they have the characters who are Comanche speak in English, um, for audience recognition. But even in that one, you will hear some of the Comanche language.
Yeah, and that's just like a movie conceit, right? Like
Right.
for us as primarily English language speakers, like we're putting out a movie where they speak in English.
Right.
But to have that Comanche dub available, I think I mean, it is like by definition groundbreaking, but I also think that it is very important.
Mm-hmm. I can see
And,
that.
and again, like this is a kind of schlocky sci-fi horror franchise, and they have done what, in my opinion, is like one of the most important, native representation things in movies in years. Is really interesting.
Yeah. No, I think it's so true. And you were kind of alluding to this, but I just want to like outright state, there are times where between you or I or one of our guests, we have a voice on this podcast from the community that is represented in something that we're talking about. That's not the case today. I don't want to speak completely for you, but I know myself, I don't have any, connection to Native American communities whatsoever in my own family heritage. Um, and I think that the point you make, that this was one episode where part of why we took our time with it is we didn't want to just watch the movie and talk about it. We both wanted to do a lot of research on it. We both wanted to read a lot more about it. Because I do, and one of the things I think that makes this even more complicated, and you've seen in terms of like some of the debates that happen over the, things like sports mascots that are considered by some people to be racist, like the former name of the Washington football team and things like that. Myself being one of the ones who thinks that they're racist, to be clear. Um, because as you mentioned, like who is in what native tribe or native community has become very convoluted in large part due to American colonialism and the kind of the intentional division of tribes. But also there's become a very politicized idea of who is or who is not part of one political group or another. And so, for example, like you have people who are part of the officially recognized by the United States government organization of like I think in the case of Florida State University, the Seminoles, that those ones are saying they have no problem with Florida State. Those are the ones who are also getting paid quite a lot by Florida State, and others who are against it. I can't claim to comment on which side is which there and which one is right or wrong, but I'm just saying that it gets a lot more complicated than just being able to find one person who says, oh, hey, no, I'm fine. I thought this movie was fine, or I thought this movie was racist, or whatever it is. And in this case, though, as far as I can see, and I think this what you're saying as well, it's not just like, oh, we found one commentator. It's fairly universal among both like historians of all backgrounds, but also people of the native communities that are being represented here who talk about the authenticity of this movie really meaning something and it being real.
Yeah, absolutely. Like that's what I mean is like you have to have some trust
Right.
as an audience member because we don't have that experience. So
Right.
pay attention to the people who do have the experience and what they say, like whatever it is, right? Like there are a lot of issues in the world where you and I want to care
Right.
about things, but we don't know what the right thing is sometimes. So we have to
Yeah.
listen and pay attention. And to me, like just baseline as a movie, as a fan of horror, this was an amazing movie. Like it
Yeah.
was just well filmed, like well acted. The action sequences were good, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, to layer what they have done to present the Comanche people in, again, like what we believe is an authentic portrayal in this movie is just like doubly good.
No, you're right. That really means a lot. And for folks who want to learn more about this, and so if you allow me to do a brief transition here into the keeping the lights on part of the podcast, there are some great books on Comanche history, including one by the cultural consultant for this movie, a guy named Jimmy Arterberry, was one of the research historians that was very involved in the making of Prey. He has a book that he worked on called the Comanche Marker Trees of Texas. That's a very specific one about the marker tree tradition. But there's a number of other great books on Comanche history that are often referenced in terms of discussions of this book, in terms of discussion of this movie. I'm going to put the notes into the show notes because if you want to get those books through bookstore.org, well, you can throw a little bit of money back to us in making this podcast. But even better, I think one of the best ways to listen to books is books on tape, audiobooks. I guess they're not really on tape anymore, but you get to listen to a book while you're doing a road trip, while you are doing the dishes, if you want something to listen to while you're wrapping presents this holiday season. And you can buy individual books through audible.com, but you can also get a yearly membership. Yearly membership means you get access to a lot of books for free. You get at least one credit for a book once a month. And that can be for like a $10 book or a $40 book. Doesn't matter. It's one credit. This is a great thing to get for yourself, but also make a wonderful gift. I think it's about $120 for the year, or you can buy it in monthly installments. And if you buy it through our link, you will get, and if you buy it through our link, not only do you get this great product that can be a great gift or great for yourself, but you also help to support the podcast. The link is in the show notes. If you go to truestory.fm/ethical audible, you'll get access to it. You won't see anything on the page, but I promise you, even if you get like the 90 days free package, whatever it is, once you've been paying for 45 days, we'll get a little bit of that back. It's a great way to support the podcast, makes a great gift. Another thing, and I'm mostly going to talk about this on the Star Wars podcast, but I can happily announce it here as well. We are now being sponsored by Level Up Lightsabers. Level Up Lightsabers is where I got my lightsabers. They're a fantastic company. Neighborhood Master Allen is the owner of the company. He was on a podcast episode that we've not been able to add the sound of yet to put up, but hopefully will be soon. He has some great thoughts about Anakin and Star Wars. You've probably seen him on TikTok or Discord or TikTok or Twitter or places like that. But if you want a lightsaber for Christmas, if you want to give someone a lightsaber for Christmas, he makes wonderful quality stuff. Again, if you go to truestory.fm/truestory.fm, again, if you go to truestory.fm/leveluplightsaber, and buy through there, you won't see it necessarily on the page, but I promise you that's the way it works. And the link is in the show notes. Those are great ways to help support the podcast, to get yourself a great gift for yourself or for someone else, or just because you want a lightsaber. Doesn't matter. Everybody needs a lightsaber. So please give some thought to that. Now back to our episode. All right, welcome back. Thank you for allowing us to keep the lights on a little bit. one other piece of representation to this movie, I think that also should be named, and I'm curious your thoughts on Riki because you know the genre better than I. Not only is this the first Predator movie with a native protagonist, but also the first woman as a protagonist. The movie Predator the original movie does not come anywhere close to the Bechdel test. I think there's literally like one or two women in the village who get slaughtered, and otherwise it's just a tale of boys being boys out in the jungle. And my understanding, certainly of the 80s action movie genre, that was fairly common. I know that, like, it's not always the case in horror, but often in horror, if there's a woman protagonist, she's much more of the like scream and run away and have to fight when she has to fight, and that people like Ripley and Alien are less common. How, for you, like how did it fit or kind of seem like it was standing out from the rest of the genre of having this be a woman character and a fairly young woman who is seen by her own community as not being the one people are like, oh yeah, she should go out and do our hunting. She's our best warrior.
I believe you're wrong on the Predator franchise. I want to say Alien versus Predator, the first one,
Mm-hmm.
had a woman. That was a very ensemble cast that gets whittled down, but the final girl,
Mm,
as they are called in horror, like slasher horror,
right.
was a black woman, I believe.
Oh, okay.
But in general, yeah, like often male dominated. There was another one. I can't remember what all of these movies are called because they're like,
They didn't stick out to you as cinematic genius.
well, no, they have like similar names. Okay, here it is. Predator 2, Alien versus Predator, Alien versus Predator Requiem, Predators, The Predator, and Prey. So they've like taken a very Fast and the Furious
Right.
tack to naming these movies, and that's why I'm like I can't keep track of like what order they are and which one is specifically which.
Right. And
Um,
what I read was that this was the first one with a female lead, but it may also be that they're thinking of the Alien versus Predator as its own franchise, or who knows how they're categorizing that.
yeah. But also like this is why like I categorize this as horror. Like a lot of these movies go into much more action, but
Mm-hmm.
this to me, like in the final girl thing, like that is a horror staple
Right.
versus like action movies like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone type things. So in the realm of horror, like the protagonist being a woman and being a strong woman is not at all an unusual thing.
Yeah.
You talked about them screaming and running away, like that's kind of like a first act thing,
Mm-hmm.
but the final act, when they become the final girl, these horror protagonist women do take agency over the situation and defeat the
Okay.
slasher or whoever through some clever means. It's not an accident. The original Terminator too like took a similar path of like horror slasherness where Linda Hamilton, Sarah Connor, like Reese was down for the count and she took agency of the situation and killed the Terminator.
Right. Okay, that's it. Yeah, I think. I mean, I'll admit I don't know as much about the horror movie genre as I do, like say action. I think I've often heard the first of the Alien movies referred to, and maybe even the second one often referred to as horror, and I think what I'd often heard is that Sigourney Weaver's character Ripley is kind of an anomaly in the genre, but it sounds like maybe it's not. And so I was thinking of those terms. Maybe it's not quite as out there. Um, but yeah, that totally makes sense.
Yeah, I mean like gosh, like the Halloween franchise,
Jamie Lee
for
Curtis, right?
example. Yeah, like Jamie Lee Curtis, like she made her name originally as a scream queen, right? Like
Right.
the screaming is iconic. But even at the end of the first movie, she defeats Michael Myers, and now like she's just completely become like badass grandma in the
Right.
thing. And again, like that's similar to the turn that Sarah Connor took in the
Yeah, I was gonna say
Terminator
Linda
franchise.
Hamilton.
Like
Yeah.
she was the damsel in distress, like through 90% of the first movie.
Right.
But then in Terminator 2 Judgment Day, she like she was buff,
Yeah,
and she knew how to, use all the guns and everything, and was like the prepper basically
yeah.
in that movie.
And I think this leads to another thing I really appreciated about this movie, Prey. I think especially when it is white people trying to tell a movie about another culture where they're trying to be like, okay, we don't want to be racist about this anymore. But you often can go kind of where it becomes almost kind of noble savage, or some other kind of idealizing a culture to the point of where you're still not really looking at it. You're looking at it as though like, oh, we white people are so bad, so everything about this other culture must be great and wonderful and perfect. And again, I think this is a story told by people in the culture, and the fact is that she's treated in very sexist ways by her community.
Yeah,
Like the guy warriors are like,
Naru.
"No, you're just a scrawny girl. You can't go out and hunt with us." And I I like that, because I like this kind of reminder of like, yeah, sexism is sexism, and it's very tied up in white supremacy to be sure, but also it's going to happen in these other communities, and like it not that I like seeing that kind of bad thing, and it's not like horrible, but it's just generally like there's at least one guy who really kind of rips her, and someone else is like, no, no, you have to be protected, and it just was nice that they weren't trying to say like everything is perfect and wonderful here. It was just saying like, yeah, this is the culture and what it was like in the early 1700s.
Yeah, but by the end of the movie, again, like in kind of typical slasher final girl way, she comes back with, I think, the scalp of the
Yeah,
predator, and her tribe is like, "Oh, okay, yeah."
yeah,
And they accept. It seems like they were going to accept her as a leader, or like a hunter.
yeah. I'll admit, because I'd heard so much about this being a kind of like pre white people culture contact community, I was a little surprised at the inclusion of the French Canadian characters in it. What did you think of their role in the movie, and like why was it necessary?
Yeah, I'm not sure
Hmm.
what what they're there for. I kind of maybe to like be bad,
Hmm.
like villain, like both villain bad, but also incompetent, right?
Right,
In order to make Naru, to elevate her as the final girl,
right,
right? Like in slashers, you have to have other characters act in not smart ways and
right.
get killed by Jason Voorhees or who are Michael Myers. Be
Hmm.
like, oh well, yeah, like they're done for, and
Yep.
that's why like this character is better.
Yeah, I think it's probably mostly that it's a way to provide more bodies. It's a way to provide like I think one of the hard parts of making a movie like Predator, which is part of why I don't always love it, but many people do, and that's awesome, is when there's only one antagonist. They don't have henchmen that you can have like small victories during the course of the movie to get like a high. They don't have like, you know, other plots you can escape from, especially when this one like it just wants to kill you. It I think they're mostly there as a plot device because in the movie what ends up happening is that the French fur trappers capture them, and so provides an escape opportunity and also a kind of moment of them being smart enough to figure out how to hide from the predator when the French are not. But I did think it felt to me like it was thematic though, in because this is about a community that has been largely untouched, that is now beginning to be invaded by people who see them not as fellow human beings, not as fellow sentient life, but just as, potential slaves or potential um, sexual objects or potential whatever. And I think that's, for me at least, the message I got of it was that that's very much how the predator see things as well. That the predator is also something who's not seeing that like, oh, this is fellow sentient life. It's, oh, these are just animals for us to hunt and prey and have enjoyment from. That may be maybe reading too much into the movie, and maybe right. We just needed some more sort of bad guys so that we could see how cool the predator was and not think it was one of our heroes getting killed. But that was definitely something I took away from it.
I also think there's a through line in the franchise of technology, like human technology not working or being
That's
enough,
true.
right?
That's true.
Like in the original one, Arnold's commandos have machine guns, and they fire blindly into the forest when they think, they're being followed by the predator, and they miss because he's invisible.
Yeah.
And it shows like the futileness of these modern weapons. And at the end, Arnold defeats the Predator with like maybe like a machete and like setting a trap with like logs.
Yeah.
I believe is what happens, like a sharpened log, like he walks them.
And they he also defeats him in part because he realizes that his vision is infrared and he covers himself in mud.
Yeah, so uses the Predator's own technology against him, which is
Right.
even more stark in Prey. Like
Right.
you literally using the Predator's like laser beam mask thingy mabob against it.
Right.
So I think that's part of it, is like showing that the French have this over reliance on firearms and how ineffective that is.
Right. Yeah, I think it's definitely the case. And just kind of, this is just not about the representation at all, just like a cool thing. This Predator's tech is not as quite as high tech as the Predator that we see in the Arnold Schwarzenegger and those movies, which makes sense because this is 300 years earlier.
Yeah.
And
I
clearly
like that.
they're an alien race that is much more advanced. They have the ability to travel between planets and the stars. But yeah, he doesn't have quite the same tech that they do 300 years later, which made sense.
It's a great attention to detail
Yeah.
for the curators of the franchise. And I'm really excited about the franchise. Like a lot of franchises kind of stumble through their sequels and they get worse and worse. And it reaches a point where you have to have some kind of reset of quality. Otherwise, you're just going to go away. You know, like the Leprechaun franchise has just like disappeared pretty much. Although they keep trying, like, but they get worse and worse. So I kind of hope they stop trying. Jason, like Friday the 13th, we haven't had one in a while. That's also like mired in like legal copyright issues.
I mean, I was gonna say, like, I don't think there's anyone who thinks Nightmare on Elm Street 12 or Friday the 13th 9 is as good as the originals. Like.
But there are like functional resets
Yeah.
where the quality goes up, and that often leads to a resurgence. I really hope that this is the beginning of that for this franchise, and that they are able to do some things, and maybe this is the answer, right? Like having like historical dramas with a Predator, like a Predator versus a European knight or a Japanese samurai
Yeah.
type of thing. Like, I don't know, like maybe that's where they need to go.
It'd be kind of great if it was just like, all right, we're gonna go to like Middle Ages Japan. We're gonna go up against like a Zulu warrior in like the 1700s or something like that. Go to someplace in Africa. Like, yeah, that could be a lot of fun.
Yeah, because the modern version got really tired. Because
Yeah.
it was just like more guns, like, and then ending up with the same, like, we're gonna beat it with a knife and like trickery. Let's just take away the machine guns at this point.
Yeah, I think it's true. So let's switch gears a little bit, because as part of our conversation about this movie, it got us talking about the sort of broader topic of Indigenous representation. And it's one that I've talked about a lot, particularly in the movie, regarding the movie Echo, or the TV show Echo, which I really felt connected to because of the amputation representation. We did an episode about that about a year ago, which is actually going to be broadcast in a week or so, because we're taking a couple weeks off around the holidays. So you'll get to hear that episode. But Riki, as you and I were talking about this, we were also talking about kind of like, how does this movie compare to the history of looking at the history of way Native Americans have been presented in cinema, in TV, and things like that. And obviously there's a very, very awful history of that, with like the John Wayne Westerns, and Native Americans always seen as this like incredible stereotypical, very little authenticity, just like, stealing children and killing women, and needing a John Wayne cowboy to go to deal with them. But we were talking about like some better examples that aren't prey, but at least are like steps along the journey. And you mentioned Dances with Wolves. And
Absolutely.
I was quite surprised, because I think I, like a lot of people, remember Dances with Wolves as an example of Hollywood getting Native representation wrong. And I'll talk more about why that is in terms of how I remember it. But you really kind of offered me a very different way of understanding it, looking at it. I went back and watched it, and you kind of convinced me. So tell me more about kind of how you see Dances with Wolves in this story of, like, in the 80s, Native rep was definitely not where it is today. And even today, it still has a long way to go. But that Dances with Wolves could actually be seen as kind of a positive step on this journey.
Yeah, for me, like I used the phrase "you're wrong" earlier, but this is like there's a podcast called "You're Wrong About" that deals with like things we think we remember about society or media or whatever.
Hmm.
And I really think like we're all wrong about Dances with Wolves,
Right.
and I blame James Cameron as I do for a lot of things.
And let me just give a quick reminder to those who either saw it many, many years ago or have never seen it or just don't know about it. Dances with Wolves was a Kevin Costner movie that was very critically acclaimed at the time, but has since been viewed very critically. It's about him as a white officer in the Union Army who, after the war, gets assigned to a post way out in what is now Colorado. At that point, is still very much kind of really on the border of Native territory and United States territory. And due to a couple of bureaucratic mishaps, he's entirely by himself, and he winds up basically getting adopted by a local native community and falling in love with a white woman who was also adopted by them because a different native community had killed their parents. And he learns to speak their language and become a part of them, and eventually like stand up against the American soldiers who eventually come to try and like defeat this group. um, it's gotten remembered though. It was very much a let's have a story about Native folks by telling a story about a white person who becomes part of them, and I think therefore has often been seen as like, oh, it's not good representation. It's a story about a white guy who hangs out with them. So that kind of frames a little. And I think there's a lot of other concerns about it, both legitimate and maybe not so much. But with that, let's talk now, Riki, about how you see it.
So just to clarify, like when I say I blame James Cameron, I'm not like strongly like against him. Like I
Hmm.
enjoyed Terminator 2, I enjoyed Aliens, like he's made some good movies. What I'm referring to obviously is Avatar, the the blue alien movie, not the last Airbender.
Uh huh.
And he was the writer director of that movie, and it has been mostly derisively called Dances with Wolves in Space or
Yeah.
Dances with Wolves with Aliens,
Dances
right?
with fat people.
Yeah. And I think that that is a somewhat accurate uh, description of the
Mhm.
movie, but also does a disservice to the original Dances with Wolves in comparison, because I think what Avatar does is much, much worse
Right.
than like how Dances with Wolves was portrayed Native people and was received at the time and the impact it had on the industry.
Mhm.
And so like I think a lot of our collective memory is like, oh well, like Avatar was Dances with Wolves in Space, and like Avatar did this thing poorly, hence Dances with Wolves did this thing
Right.
poorly. And I think that that is just like completely wrong on multiple levels.
I think I hear what you're saying. I will say that I think there's a longer history in between Dances with Wolves and Avatar. Like we've talked about the movie The Last Samurai, which feels very similar. And but in that one, it's Tom Cruise who gets captured by a samurai community in the 19th century, and then becomes one of them and becomes even better than any of them. And that movie was often referred to as Dances with Samurai. So I don't think it's
Mhm.
just James Cameron, but yeah, there's this movie has become a touchstone of, oh yeah, it's just one more white person goes off to be with this alien exotic community and becomes the exemplary member of them. But I think kind of what we're getting to is that Dancing with Wolves actually is that is a very real trope that happens in Hollywood. But Dancing with Wolves in some ways really subverts that.
Yeah, and obviously like I have feelings that I will probably talk about for The Last Samurai as
Hmm.
well. And part so let's like set the timeline. Dances with Wolves was in 1990.
Hmm.
The Last Samurai was 2003, and then Avatar was 2009.
Right.
So that's like that's the progression. I do think like part of it is because Avatar was or still is the number one grossing movie of all time, right? That it had such an impact on the movie industry that
Right.
year and was talked about and everyone watched it. So that's part of it. Why it is framed in this way, or like why we remember it in this way and don't remember The Last Samurai as much, I think,
Yeah.
culturally, is that just like Avatar was culturally huge. And then so in that discussion, like Dances with Wolves gets compared, and that's why it gets remembered in this way. I think without Avatar, if it was just The Last Samurai, would we have a better memory of Dances with Wolves just because The Last Samurai didn't have that cultural impact? Maybe. I don't know.
I mean, I think I heard the term like 7 years in Tibet was referred to as dancing with the Dalai Lama, like dancing with the Dalai Lama. Like I definitely heard that term in many other cases. But either way, let's get into why is it you see Dancing with Wolves as a more positive example of representation. Still not great compared to something like Prey, but at least a lot more positive than some of the other examples we're talking about.
So yeah, I did like a deep dive into the cast of
Mm-hmm.
Dances with Wolves, and this is another situation where yeah, obviously Kevin Costner is the main star, like he was the writer director, and it's all about him. But you look at this cast, and you have like all of the native people that he comes into contact with are being played by native performers.
Right.
And some of these names, like Graham Greene is the most prolific of them. Like he got an Oscar nomination for his performance in this movie as Kicking Bird. Did not win, but he went on to be in a lot of stuff. What I have here is he was in The Green Mile. He was in Die Hard 3, are like the two most prominent ones that I came across, but of
Mm-hmm.
like a huge resume. Before this movie, he's a Canadian actor. Before this movie, he was in 7 TV shows that I've never heard of because it's CTV,
Mm-hmm.
and 3 movies, and then became a star. Right, Wes Studi, who plays a character that is only listed as toughest Pawnee.
Right.
That was the tribe that was opposing them in the
Mm-hmm.
movie, opposing like the protagonist tribe. But Wes Studi was only in 1 movie prior to Dances with Wolves, although it seems to have been a prominent one because several other of the actors were in this movie. It's called Pow Wow Highway,
Mm-hmm.
produced by George Harrison of all people. And then after this movie, Wes Studi went on to be in Last of the Mohicans.
Right.
A,
Where he played Magua, which in both of those movies, there's kind of like the good native tribe and the bad one, and
Mhm.
in both he's the chief of the bad one,
Yeah.
which is kind of an interesting thing all to itself. But moving
Well,
on.
he's got like villain face because
Yeah.
he was also in Geronimo. He was in the Street Fighter movie with Jean-Claude Van Damme
Mm-hmm.
playing Sagat, a villain, which is like weird because he's supposed to be Thai, but that's another problem we have with the industry.
Yep.
But Wes Studi was on a New York Times list of 25 greatest actors of the 21st century so far.
That's pretty
In
cool.
2019, he was honored by the Motion Picture Academy for an honorary award. And so again, he was in 1 movie prior to Dances with Wolves, and
Yeah.
has gone on to become this performer.
And
Another
he does
like
not have a huge part in this, but I will say another movie we want watch at some point. I don't know how good it's considered beyond representation, but the movie of Dances with the movie of The Last of the Mohicans that he has a much bigger part in, that's Daniel Day-Lewis stars in, is phenomenal, and he is phenomenal in it. So that should
yeah,
not surprise
and
me.
arguably like auditioned for that movie via this role, right? Like as
Right.
toughest Pawnee, like the leader of the enemy.
Yep.
And the third major one that I'll mention is Rodney A. Grant, played Wind in His Hair, who is Kevin Costner's like best friend, has the very emotional thing at the end where he's standing up on the cliff as they're leaving the tribe, and he's like, I am Wind in His Hair, like Dances with Wolves is my friend, right? Like the very emotional farewell.
Mm-hmm.
Rodney A. Grant was in 2 movies prior to this, to Dances, and then went on to be in the Geronimo movie again, and then was in 22 episodes of a TV show called Hawkeye, interestingly starring Lee Horsley and Linda Carter, Wonder Woman. So from an acting perspective, like this movie gave people a chance and
Right.
gave them a huge platform. Like Kevin Costner was a star at this point, right? Like 1990 is right after like all like Field of Dreams, and he was a star, which is
Right.
arguably like why he got to make this movie. And you know, he put himself in the center of it. Yes, like
Hmm.
a like kind of white savior ish, but use that platform to elevate these performers, these native performers, and put them on the stage with him and let
Right.
them shine. And then they went on to have these amazing careers. And so that to me is like how I view the impact of this movie
Hmm.
is yes, I think some aspects of it have aged poorly, but I think everything should age poorly
Yeah.
because that's what progress means, is that we get better and we get a movie like Prey where now the protagonist
Right.
is a native performer.
Right. Well, because it's that like I think Dances with Wolves is a movie made by white people for white people with the help of members of the Lakota community, and that's a step towards Prey, but it's obviously a ways behind. Just to say a couple other things on the representation in it. The Lakota language is what is used among the people who um
Mhm.
Kevin Costner is with. They're referred to as both the Lakota and the Sioux, and there's some debate around that because Sioux is actually uh, there's some who understand it as that Sioux is a word for snake and was used as like kind of a negative term. Others used for the Lakota. That's kind of a complicated issue. Um, the the person who worked with them on the language was a person named Doris Leader Charge, who was a Lakota language expert.
Mhm.
It is a simplified version of Lakota, I think, because it's supposed to be more historically accurate, but it's one that sounded very weird to modern Lakota speakers, and so there's some question of that. Like,
Yeah.
it definitely seems like they were trying to be more authentic, and the visual representation was considered far more authentic than a lot of the kind of stereotypical Hollywood stuff up till that point. Not perfect by any means, and
No.
reading through it, I read because again, as you said, like the best people to listen to are experts within those communities. I was surprised that there were a lot of folks who had including from the Lakota Nation, a lot of folks who had very positive memories of this movie as like, yeah, it wasn't great, but it was a good step forward. In part because of what you said. Um, I mentioned before, like in the horrible history, even like in those John Ford movies, not only was it horrible representation of Native Americans, but most of the time it wasn't even Native actors playing those roles. It was
Exactly.
often like white people in red face or Mexicans or someone like that. So it's a step forward with the acting. It's a step forward with other things like that. Um, I will say just as my own bit of it, um, a kind of representation that it really aged badly is that the movie starts with Kevin Costner in a Civil War battle, learning that they might amputate his leg, him immediately deciding that he should try to kill himself because obviously having his leg amputated is the worst thing that could possibly happen. And then when a general like sees that he
Mm.
did something great, him being like, just don't amputate my leg, don't let them take my leg. Um, as someone who's had my leg amputated, it's not actually the end of the world. So I just kind of wanted to push that forward. Um, but also, obviously, I didn't have my leg amputated in the 1860s. It was probably much worse then, etc. But it just, as a disabled person, that scene did not age well.
Yeah,
But
that's
Avatar is also horrifically ableist because the whole point is that the guy
Mm.
can ignore his wheelchair. So that's a whole other thing. But
I
yeah,
want to
getting
go I want to
go
go
ahead.
back to the thing about the language.
Yeah.
Because like we mentioned that not the mixing of like tribes and stuff like historically, right? So like
Mhm.
this movie, the Lakota, Graham Greene is from the Oneida tribe. Rodney Grant is Omaha. Wes Studi, who plays the Pawnee, is Cherokee. So like part of the problem is like you cannot. I don't know if cannot is right, but they didn't get all the right people, so to
Right.
speak. But what I did read related to your language thing was that I can't I don't have the exact reference, but one of the actors who was called upon to speak Lakota Sioux almost got cut from the movie because he couldn't get it right,
Mm.
and he had to like practice real hard to get it right, and then they let him have the speaking roles. So that at least speaks to some dedication to an authenticity, right?
Right.
That, hey, like if you can't do this right, like we don't want you on screen for this.
And one of the people who speaks the language fairly well, because I imagine he worked with it and could afford to have, the best tutors in the world, is Kevin Costner himself. There's a lot more native language used in this movie than there is in Prey. Clearly, the actors in Prey, I think, wouldn't have had a trouble with that language, but I did think that was interesting to watch when I'm thinking about these two movies and how much it involved also both Kevin Costner and the actress whose name I forget, but who plays the sort of white woman who's part of the community.
Mary McDonald.
Mary McDonald, thank you. She also speaks Lakota in the movie, so it's interesting stuff. Yeah, so I just thought it was interesting watching it again. Like the other thing that I read that I thought was a really interesting commentary on it, and I'll see if I can find this article. It's written by a native author, and he talks about how this is a big step forward, but it still has a fundamental problem. And
Yeah,
I hadn't seen it
course.
this way, but it made a lot of sense, which is he said that this is something you start seeing around this time where it's a movie about how there's white people are wrong and treat the people of whatever community it is badly, but always that there is a good white person or maybe a couple of good white people and a lot of bad white people, and also that there is good members of the other group and bad members, and that the way the Lakota and the Pawnee are positioned really falls into that. Of there's a lot of like,
Yeah.
well, not that, oh, your ideas of the natives are wrong, but your ideas of the natives are right in the Pawnee, but not
Yeah.
all of them are like that. And I thought that was a really interesting analysis of like, yeah, like there's a way in which this is taking a step forwards, but also sort of reaffirming a lot of problematic thoughts about these things.
Yeah, that's the thing is like I tried to look up like what the most famous or like best um movie about natives in the 1980s
Uh-huh.
was, just to see like okay, like what happened before that, because I talked about what happened after that, which is like these people got a lot of roles, like Dance Last of the Mohicans was also like a huge Oscar movie
Mm-hmm.
and all that. In the 80s, like the best I could come up with, a movie called Wind Waker, I believe,
Mm-hmm.
or Walker. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact title. And in that movie, the protagonist, who was supposed to be native, was played by a white guy. So that's
Yeah.
like that's what was going on before Dances with Wolves. And I agree, like there are problems with it, but it was, in my opinion, a huge step forward
Right.
in terms of representation. And
And I'll say, I think one of the other movies that's often cited as, not perfect by any means, made by Robert De Niro and starring Val Kilmer, but still a good step in a good direction, is a movie called Thunderheart, which
mm,
is kind of it's a modern day story about a white detective working with a native detective, um, and it touches on a lot of the stuff that led to Wounded Knee in 1973, which is a big kind of native group fighting for their rights and really gotten really complicated things. And that movie, I think, is very much made possible by Dances with Wolves and tried to be fairly authentic to that community in the 1970s. And the main native character is played by Graham Greene. So I
there
think
you
that's
go.
kind of that's the movie I thought at first you can reference that I often think of as the other great kind of 90s native representation for its time. And definitely, like I think if Dances with Wolves doesn't get made, Thunderheart absolutely does not get made.
Yeah. Like same with Last of the Mohicans. I think that was just like 2 or 3 years later. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously, like there's a certain cynical money grab element to that, right? It was
Right.
probably like they saw the success and like, well, like, why don't we try to make one?
Yeah. And I think, because that's based on a Nathaniel Hawthorne novel that's hundreds of years old. But I think there had been an earlier version of Last of the Mohicans that probably is very
Mm,
much of the John Ford kind of idea of natives. And Last of the Mohican is still a story about white people, but better than other stuff. That now I really want to go back and watch that movie because I remember it as being just a really wonderful love story and adventure movie. And it was one of my father's favorite stories. My father used to read that story to me as a kid. Not He wasn't reading Nathaniel Hawthorne to me, but he had like a kid's version of it. But now I'm kind of curious and nervous to go back and watch it and be like, oh, okay, yeah, some parts of this aged pretty well, or oh no, this is a movie that should have stayed where it is. Have you
Mm.
seen it in any kind of recent history?
Last of the Mohicans?
Yeah,
No, I don't even remember if I've actually seen the movie. I remember scenes, so maybe like I saw parts of it on TV
right.
back in the day.
The Daniel Day-Lewis "Stay alive, I will find you" was certainly a
Mm.
very memed comment for a long time. So, all right, well, I think we've had a lot to say of this. You kind of mentioned that there might be a word or two to say about Last Samurai. And do you want to say anything about that now, or do you want to say that actually for our bonus section?
Well, I don't know. Like what I want to say, I think importantly is that obviously like these issues aren't solved even today.
Right.
And part of the reason they aren't solved is like history happened, and
Mm-hmm.
the United States of America was built on stolen land, and there's no way to fix that.
Right.
But taking steps in movies and representation and like how we portray history is
Mm-hmm.
important. And as I talked about, like with the actors, like giving people from those communities the opportunity to represent themselves is important.
Yep.
And just like giving voice, like one of the things, and when I say it's not solved, like there was that Lone Ranger movie. I don't know if you saw this.
Oh, with
It's
Johnny Depp as Tonto.
yes. That was what, like 5 years ago or something?
Yeah, it's pretty recent.
So it's like we talk about it like how bad it was. It's still happening.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the depressing part of it is like that's just ridiculous, right? Like that movie should be lambasted for that, to do that in this age.
Mm-hmm.
Um there was a the character Chakotay in Star Trek Voyager.
Yep.
Uh just terrible. Like I have this information pulled up here. They had a I'm using air quotes here now. This is very important. They had a quote Native American heritage consultant on call for Voyager to try to give authenticity to the character of Chakotay. Uh, his name was Jamake Highwater. He was a white guy,
Yeah.
faking his way. He was born Jackie Marks. He was exposed to have zero native heritage.
Was he? I thought he was Mexican, which is decidedly not native, but also not white.
I've like maybe mixed.
Okay.
I believe like one of the things I saw reference was Irish.
Oh, okay.
Um, but he probably had some non-Irish heritage to have darker skin to
Right.
be able to play this role. And there's a
Right.
role, like he's playing this role. He scammed people. He got these jobs as a consultant, and it's like, no. I mean, even if I'm gonna be generous and say, even if you are an expert in the field, in the study of the history, let someone from that culture do
Yeah.
that job specifically, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's really true, and I think and while I had not heard quite so much about the actor himself, and I think that he certainly opened some criticism. Let's be clear that the writers were not, hiring all the cultural consultants. Like there's a number of stories involving him and his connection to his people and native communities that are just the worst parts of like there's a scene in the TV show Echo where one of the characters in the native community runs a kind of tourist store.
Mm,
And there's a scene of like these two white people who are like, "Oh yes, we're looking for crystals to engage our spirituality." And it's clear that they know nothing about native actual spiritual practices. And the guy selling them stuff is perfectly happy to sell them a rock and be like, "This is $50 because it, um, making fun of that." And I feel like the white people who come into the store in that show could as easily been the writers of Star Trek. Like it very much feels like white people writing about Native American spiritual vision quests that for Chakotay to go on. But yeah, you're right. The
Yeah,
character.
and this is Star Trek, like a beloved franchise that celebrates diversity, and they got it wrong in a very embarrassing way. And
You know,
if you've seen Prodigy, like I think that they are kind of redeeming Chakotay's character in
yep.
that, and trying to do right on the wrongs that were done on that
hmm
on Voyager. So that's at least something good that's coming out of it.
Yeah.
But
And we're going to talk about more about this in the bonus section for members. We're going to talk a little bit more about, obviously we're here talking about Native Americans, and I think that there is truth to the idea that indigenous communities around the world are treated badly, and that their media and culture is often used by non-indigenous communities for the benefit of them. But I also don't want to paint with. I think it's easy to say like, oh, like the issues that people in the Lakota community in the United States and the people in a Native community somewhere else in the world are the same. In our bonus member content, we're going to talk a little bit about both good and bad examples of how other Native communities have been treated in some of the media we care about. And of course, you can become a member for just $5 a month, $55 a year. You get access to those. We're finally starting in January, going to be starting to do our superhero ethics full bonus member episodes. We're going to be looking at some of kind of like the core questions of what superhero ethics is all about, and doing those on a monthly basis. Those will be free episodes for members. You get free bonus content, and of course, you get to help keep the lights on and keep us funded and all those kind of good things. But so just in closing, before we get to that member content, Riki, do you want to talk just about what are your thoughts as a Japanese American, as a person who enjoys a lot of the media on the movie The Last Samurai, and how does that differ from Dances with Wolves?
here's the thing. I enjoyed The Last Samurai when I watched it in theaters, and I did watch it in theaters.
Yeah.
It's a well-made movie,
Mm-hmm.
and it is well acted as well. And so like it's hard for me to kind of balance that with like, well, like what are they doing here? And like so comparing it to Dances with Wolves, I think there's a difference of, because you mentioned to me like, well, like in Dances with Wolves, like, or sorry, The Last Samurai allowed Ken Watanabe to become a star,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is 100% true, like from a like Western Hollywood perspective,
Right.
because he was already a star in Japan,
Right.
like a huge star. As was Hiroyuki Sanada, who was like a secondary character in the movie. Like they were both established stars.
Right.
So to me, like that's the difference of like Dances with Wolves gave these opportunities to people who, Graham Greene was probably the best known from in Canada, but
Right.
otherwise just like really elevated people who had no platform.
Right. Well,
At
and
all.
part of that's Dances with what I connect the two movies. And I think a lot of people connect the two movies because they're about white people engaging in a non-white community, and then kind of the quote unquote going native, which is itself a very problematic term. But you're right. Like there is a Japanese media industry in the way there isn't for the Lakota people
Yeah.
or Comanche or
And
whatever.
and I'm absolutely appreciative that more people have gotten to experience Ken Watanabe and Hiroyuki
Right.
Sanada. Like the latter, especially, like he's a absolute treasure.
Right. But yeah, this
So
is more like
that's good.
it's like Ichiro coming to the United States. Like it's a much bigger career opportunity, but it wasn't like he couldn't play baseball.
Yeah, exactly. And then like there's just other kind of details that as you look into them, they become more problematic, or they age poorly. Like Dances with Wolves was filmed in the American West,
Right.
right? Like it is authentic filmography to the place.
Right.
And it's beautiful. Like the cinematography is beautiful. I believe that was one of the Oscars that it won.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Best picture, best director, screenplay, cinematography, sound, film editing, music, where it's Oscar wins. The Last Samurai, quite a few of the like outdoor, like the beautiful cinematography portions of The Last Samurai were filmed in New Zealand,
Fair.
which is beautiful,
Right.
like as we know from Lord of the Rings. But but it gives you that like itch of like, why? Like
Right.
Japan is beautiful in itself. Now it's possible that they just like couldn't find the right location. Like part of the reason a lot of stuff gets filmed in New Zealand is because it's empty
Right.
of like human civilization.
Whereas like a lot of
Um,
the parts of Japan, like of feudal Japan, just have been urbanized and things like that. But
yeah, so like especially for 2003, like nowadays, you could probably film in Japan and just like CGI like modern buildings out,
true.
right? Like that's the thing. Like but then it's like, what's the authenticity of that? And that's kind of brings to mind Avatar, right? Like
Right.
the cinematography is all fake.
Yeah.
And,
Well,
and again, like that's why I think Dances with Wolves is still so important and
mhm.
should be remembered better. Is that like they gave that authenticity to the place?
I think that's really true. And I'll also just add one other thing that, for me at least, as a person who, let me back it up. I think all that's true. And I think to me, there's one other factor that is to me fairly damning for Last Samurai, which is say, as again, as someone who I really enjoyed the movie. Like I think the fight scenes are great. I think it's beautiful. I think Tom Cruise can be a really good actor at times, and I thought he was very good in this. Um, but the movie is set against the backdrop of the Meiji Restoration and a civil war within Japan that sets the movie very much as this is the last remembrance of beautiful, authentic, quote unquote, the way white people will say it, feudal Japan against the evil Western industrialists. And that's very much the way the movie sets it up, and that like the samurais have this beautiful way of life, but the Westerners want to bring in capitalism and modern armies and stuff like that. And yeah, I saw that as a beautiful story until I watched Kenshin.
I
A
was gonna
series
say that, yeah.
movies and TV shows that we've talked about a lot that is set in this same time period, but Kenshin's on the side of the restoration. And it caused me to do a lot more like digging into the history of this time. And I think like any historical period, um, finding saying like these people are good and these people are bad is it's much more nuanced and complex than that. But certainly it felt very much like if you really understand the history of that time, for Last Samurai to sort of state so clearly these were the good guys and these were the bad guys is very much a Westerner trying to take on elements of a history that they do not understand and simplify it to tell their story, which I think is kind of like one of the worst kinds of cultural appropriation and non-representation. So
Yeah.
that it
So
just
you're
go ahead.
well, I just want to make sure people know, like you're talking about Rurouni Kenshin, which is a manga anime, and there were a couple of live action movies,
Mhm.
Japanese live action movies that are available on Netflix
Yep. And
and
we've done a
US.
number of
Yeah.
episodes about different of the movies and the anime and stuff like that.
And I'm glad you brought that up because the way The Last Samurai presents the conflict is that the Meiji government is like all modernized. They have guns, they have Gatling guns, and then the
Mhm.
other side, the samurai side, are on horseback, right?
Right.
Like drawing their swords. And as you said in Kenshin, like both sides have both.
Yeah.
Like there are swordsmen on both sides, there are guns on both sides. So like it wasn't it wasn't as like from a governmental like historical perspective, yes, it was like modern versus traditional, but from a warfare perspective it was pretty even.
Right. In Kenshin, there's a long like there's a long plot line. I think it's in the second of the live action movies where the non-industrialist side has a battleship, and it's like a
Yeah,
19th century like top of the line battleship.
yeah, so
As opposed
that's
to
where The Last Samurai like presents this very romanticized
yeah,
version of history of like the samurai and their last charge, right? It's like, well, that's not. And then I also like, who is the last samurai? Is it Tom Cruise? Because
it
that's kind of sucky.
yeah, like I think you can read it as it's about Ken Watanabe's character,
Yeah.
but like yeah, it could go either way.
And the fact, okay, and this is like my biggest issue from a historical perspective, like comparing it to Dances with Wolves.
Hmm.
In Dances with Wolves, Kevin Costner's character observes history,
Right.
right? And maybe there's a bit of white saviorness in that he convinces the tribe to move and he saves their lives, perhaps, or at least like delays the inevitable of the encroachment of white settlers, in terms of the impact on that tribe. But in The Last Samurai, Tom Cruise's character survives the final battle, brings the sword, Watanabe's sword, to the emperor, and convinces the emperor to change his policy by
Right.
reminding him of like the samurai spirit, and to like stand against the United States. Or don't forget the Japanese Yamato spirit type
Right.
of thing. And like that's like the most white savior
Mhm.
bullshit of all time, in my opinion. Like for
Right.
these movies, like maybe Avatar is worse because he's literally the chosen one and can pilot or ride the dragon thingy, right? Like
Yeah.
that's kind of similar. But that's where I like Tom Cruise's character like changes history.
Yeah.
By convincing the emperor.
It really is. I think the white savior complex is so important there, as is this idea that Echo, actually, that TV show, does highlight a little bit, which is this idea that often, because of this, and because, like I said, of like, go on IKEA or not IKEA, but go on like a lot of like Christmas websites, and you'll find a lot of like, this is an authentically Navajo made or authentically made by the indigenous people of. There's actually a great line in Fight Club about indigenously made by the hardworking indigenous people of wherever. Like no one cares. It's just this white idea, and I think this is an echo. It might have been another TV show, but again, in that kind of like the tchotchkes store, the tourist store, the white folks come in, and like I think it's the uncle or the grandfather of Echo. He changes the way he speaks to speak more of the kind of like white man say, like the kind of like Western idea, white man's idea of what it should be. And there's a moment where like his cell phone goes off and they give him dirty looks because they're like, you're not supposed to have cell phones. You're supposed to be our image of like perfected, authentic, history that we want to romanticize and experience, but still have our cell phones. And to me, that very much felt like Last Samurai of, we want to be able to, while being participants of the capitalist culture that helped to end this, we still want to be able to romanticize that without remembering, as we talked about in Kenshin, that part of the samurai spirit that they were overthrowing was the ability to kill anyone who you thought was disrespecting you as a samurai. Like it was not, the perfect romanticized thing. So,
yeah. And the thing is, like, from a historical perspective, The Last Samurai is probably just like some general or prime minister in the Meiji government, because again, like it's not like they waged a war on all samurai. There's just like these particular ones in certain provinces that didn't want to go along with this,
right?
But like plenty of samurai did, and they got positions in the government.
Yeah, because among other things, they were often some of the most educated people in the country at that time. So
or rich.
Yeah, that too. All right. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I'm sure it's a topic we're going to return to a lot more. People, as always, I would love to hear your thoughts, your comments, your feedback, things you like, things you didn't like, whatever you had to say about it. We will have all the information on our show notes, as well as information about how to take advantage of those two great deals. Audible membership, lightsabers. These make great Christmas gifts or holiday gifts, whatever kind. Please think about doing that. Please think about becoming a member. If you are a member, stick around. We're going to have some bonus content for you in a moment. But for everyone else, we have spoken.
I'm the Last Samurai.
I'm Spartan.